We believe that the prosperity of Britain and the standard of living of all our peoples, which is what it means, would improve faster if we were inside the common market than if we remained outside.
In December 1970, the opinion polls showed 70% of the public against membership and only 18% in favour. Although it wasn't up to the public to decide, as it was later on during the referendum, nevertheless, with this sort of hostility, Parliament would have had great difficulty in passing it.
Ernest Wistrich, who in the 1970s was in charge of the European movement in Britain. And there was the political problem. The Conservative Party, who'd won an unexpected victory in the general election of 1970, were committed to negotiating their way into the European Economic Community. The new Prime Minister, Edward Heath, after all, was a lifelong European. But public opinion in Britain was distinctly lukewarm about Brussels and all its works. Twice before, under previous governments, Tory and Labour, we'd been given our marching orders by the French. So why try to join a club that didn't want us? How to change public opinion? Make the case for Europe in the newspapers. And that's where the woman mentioned by Norman Redaway joins the story. Her name, you'll recall, Alison Christopher. She was personal assistant to the Conservative MP Sir Tufton Beamish, and a friend to all those pro-European Tories in the House of Commons, like Sir James Spicer.
Well, she was a sort of almost MI5, MI6 rolled into one. The most amazing woman. She was struck down by polio at the age of 19, 20. She lived in a wheelchair, and she ran Tufton extremely well. She ran me extremely well, and because we all had great confidence in her, she was in a position to, unseen, virtually, to get us to sign letters when and if they were required to the press.
Where did she operate from?
From a basement room just off Sloane Square. That sounds very, very undercover. But it was a tiny little office, with always a good glass of sherry there, but, I mean, we had a little gathering every Wednesday morning of people, mostly MPs, and each and every one of those on a Wednesday, if they were asked to sign a letter, would very happily do it. And I think the same group still exists today, and they still are. But we don't talk about it. You know, it was I look back 30 years, and I think of a very happy group of people who really had this shared belief.
Our position was pro-European, but we had a policy of allowing the debate to take place freely.
Lord Rees-Mogg, who, as William Rees-Mogg, was the editor of the Times back in the 70s.
I simply think that at that time the pro-people understood the issues better, had a more sophisticated approach, whereas the anti-people were, in fact, included a significant number of what you could regard as backwoodsmen.
But it will be possible to manipulate the correspondence from outside without necessarily your editorial staff or indeed yourself being alerted.
Well, if you had a lot of people who were persuaded that they ought to send in letters which were in fact drafted by somebody else, then obviously you could organise a better correspondence on your side than if you just left it to the general public. I think that's probably true, but I imagine most of the letter writers were perfectly genuine people.
Letter writing was all very well, but preaching the benefits of British membership of the common market in the letters columns of the Times really was preaching to a pretty small congregation. The big prize was to convert the millions of people who didn't read the Times, and that began and continued through 1970 and 1971 here in the heart of Mayfair. I'm walking to one of London's most exclusive hotels, the Connaught, where every week, as Edward Heath's government inched Britain towards Europe, Geoffrey Tucker, an advertising guru who helped to market the Conservative Party, organised breakfasts for the political shakers and the media movers of the day. Very good breakfast too, to judge by this hotel's reputation.
Ted very typically said, well, if that's your opinion, get on with it, and that's what I did.
Geoffrey Tucker, master of the breakfast ceremonies at the Connaught and a passionate European, told Edward Heath that he knew how to swing the great British public behind the government's European adventure.
I went to the European movement and talked to them, and they helped to put the funding together for a breakfast which we held at the Connaught Hotel. And Ernest Wistrich was there actually to be briefed in many ways
briefed on how the negotiations, led by Geoffrey Rippon and his most senior civil servant, Crispin Tickell, were going in Brussels. Journalists were there, and captains of industry, editors too, and television people. Ernest Wistrich's European movement was the natural organisation to front the public campaign for Europe. This is where Norman Redaway from the Foreign Office slides into our story again. Was Wistrich the right man for the movement?
Remember one day Norman Redaway, after some weeks, coming to me and saying, "We're satisfied, you go ahead and run it."
What do you think he had to be satisfied about?
Well, obviously I was being vetted for security reasons and other purposes as well.
But why would security be an issue?
Well, this is the odd thing, but it certainly was. I know that.
Norman Redaway was the person given to us by the government as our liaison man. And he came to the breakfast carrying his bicycle clips and his furry gloves. And I had an agitated doorman who said to me, "Excuse me, sir, but I believe you have a Mr. Redaway as your guest. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to ask him to desist from his habit." So I said, "What habit is this?" And he said, "We do find it very disturbing when he padlocks his moped to the front railings of the hotel. It's disturbed Mr. David Niven no end, sir." And I had to ask him if he would padlock it to the back of the hotel. He was a remarkable and delightful and eccentric man.
Did you know which department in government he worked for?
I did have an idea, but it didn't really mean very much to me. I mean, IRD was a government department that he was associated with, and a person who also was with him called Tommy Tucker, same name as mine, but he was taller, thinner and better looking than I was, and he did a lot of the work. They were very skilled in carrying on the work that we did into the press and into publications. But I really didn't know very much about him. I was, I suppose, incurious, and also Norman was not a person who sort of was very forthcoming about what he actually did.
For good reason. The Information Research Department in the Foreign Office seems to have had links with the intelligence community. Certainly, earlier in his career, Norman Redaway's IRD had played a part in destabilizing the Sukarno regime in Indonesia in the 1960s. Anyway, the 1970s. What was on the political menu at those Connaught breakfasts? Carving up the media, it seems.
We had the imprimatur, OK, from Ted. We had the links through Norman Redaway to the Foreign Office. We had a knowledge of what actually was going on from Geoffrey Rippon and from Crispin Tickell. And therefore we got on with a very specific job. We decided to pinpoint the Today programme on radio, picked up by the press and followed right through the news programmes during the day, culminating with the news programme on ITN at night, which was the big one. So round the table came people like Marshall Stewart, who was the brilliant editor of the Today programme, which was a key programme, and they sat down with people who were actually negotiating in Brussels. During that time we achieved a thing which we couldn't have achieved today, which is we got an extra 5 minutes on the ITN news in the evening added on, which was purely informative, what it meant to the ordinary person.
That 5 minutes came out of a direct negotiation with Nigel Ryan, who was editor of ITN, across one of those breakfast tables.
Yeah, across one of those breakfast tables. I mean, it was a wonderful, wonderful news opportunity. Even Alistair Campbell couldn't have done better, I feel.
You mean you were offering them scoops?
Yes.
Could we go to 68 St James's in Mayfair, please? Dean Street, yes please. Thank you very much. So, is there evidence to back this up? There is, and Geoffrey Tucker dispatches me to his office, to Deborah, his personal assistant.
Hello?
Oh, hello, it's Christopher Cook from the BBC to see Geoffrey Tucker.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
A couple of the documents here.
Good.
You can have a read through, and then if you want to take a photocopy, that's fine.
This document from Geoffrey Tucker's personal archive is called European Campaign. It's dated 1970-71. On the first page is a paragraph with the heading Objective. I quote, "To convince MPs that the tide of British public opinion is moving towards joining the EEC." Then, in a later paragraph on method, you find, "We must rely greatly on the fast media. Therefore television and radio will play the major part in the campaign." The television programmes News at 10, 24 Hours and Panorama are mentioned, and from radio, World at 1, Today and Woman's Hour. 4 pages further on comes this. Nobbling is the name of the game. Throughout the period of the campaign there should be direct day-by-day communication between the key communicators and our personnel, e.g. the Foreign Commonwealth Office and Marshal Stewart of the Today programme.